afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. So I think that this is going to be the toughest session of them all, because I think there's a lot of material, and the material is a little bit, I guess, technical and a bit challenging. And I mean this in the sense of, I'm going to show you a lot of charts, and it's going to get a bit, detailed, a bit. I'm just wondering whether, students out there, because although there are some topical issues here that will make it maybe lively and colorful, it's going to be, I think, a little bit. It's going to require all your attention and all my energy and the energy that you're going to give me to bounce. So I'm going to feed off your energy. So in the first part, we're going to do manufacturing services and urbanization. First, manufacturing services, and then we'll do trade and international trade and internal trade. Now, so I'm actually going to show you something that I was not. See, it kind of starts with what I said in the morning, that all structural transformation that have happened amongst developed countries and also amongst some of the East Asian countries. So in the top chart, what you see employment on the left-hand side and value added on the right-hand side. And essentially, this is the y-axis everywhere is the share. So structural transformation in economic development basically is about employment share declining. And the dots you see are for different countries. The different countries are shown at the bottom. But basically, the pattern is very clear. Employment share declines in agriculture. Employment share increases in services. But interesting, manufacturing employment share first increases, and then decreases. So this is pretty much the historical pattern in almost all countries. And of course, the same thing happens in value added, but you can see that the decline in employment is much sharper, which I showed you earlier, slower in a thing, but essentially the patterns are the same. So all economic transformation is about declining agriculture, increasing services, and increasing manufacturing up to a point in time, and then declining. So this is, I think, a first order fact about structural transformation all over the world that we should, keep in mind when we, as we go through this session. So notice that, is manufacturing special? So Lee Kuan Yew, who's of course, the man who created Singapore, he came to JNU and gave a lecture where he said, since the Industrial Revolution, no country has become a major economy without being an industrial power, right? And this, I think we all kind of, at heart, we see that. And of course, it's backed up by data. All rich countries who have become greater than $24,000 per capita have experienced manufacturing employment shares greater than 20%. So in a sense, you could say that if you can go above 20%, there's a good chance that you'll become industrial, that you'll become rich. The country as a whole will become rich. Now, this is the data here. It's not quite what I want to say. It shows a slightly different thing, but I'll show it to you in India. So, and I can, as a small exercise. So this is on the x-axis, you have per capita GDP of a state. And then on the y-axis, you have share, it's the peak share of employment in the different states, i.e., what was the maximum amount of employment achieved in manufacturing as a share of total employment. And what you see is that a very, even within India, there's a positive slope. That is, states that have acquired high amount of peak employment in manufacturing tend to be richer. And in a sense, this chart is a variation of not strictly that, but essentially this second point, you will see that those countries that have had very high employment shares, peak employment shares, have also gone on to become rich. So then the question is, why is that? What is special about manufacturing that? So if there's one takeaway from this lecture this morning, this afternoon, on this, I want you to take away is the following. In some ways, manufacturing, services are all labels, and these labels should not be strictly taken as for what they are. You have to go one step behind and say, what is it about some of these things about manufacturing or services that makes them special? So it's not manufacturing per se, but there's something underlying about manufacturing, something underlying also about services that potentially makes them special. So that's what I want you to focus on and take away from this session. Now, why is manufacturing special? I mean, basically manufacturing is special because for a long time we think that it has a lot of potential to generate externalities for other sectors. It has a lot of potential to lead to skill creation. It has a lot of potential to become a source of exports, which itself has a lot of positive benefits and so on. So manufacturing seems to have been special because it has had some of these underlying attributes. High productivity, lots of potential spillover benefits to the rest of the economy, ability to become tradable, and therefore you export a lot and you learn a lot by doing that, and also you can become part of international value added chains and so on. So it's not so much manufacturing per se, but something about manufacturing that's special. And that's why going back to Caldor, going back to Kenneth Arrow, and all, the whole Mahalanobis model was predicated on, the fact that, we needed to do manufacturing and there was something special about manufacturing. Now, more recently, Danny Roderick has added another dimension, a kind of empirical dimension to what makes manufacturing special. And his observation is that essentially manufacturing provides an automatic ladder for productivity growth. And what he says is that this is the chart that he has. This is, remember we did convergence, this is unconditional convergence in manufacturing. That is, if you somehow start doing manufacturing, over time, manufacturing productivity growth will be more rapid. So in terms of, therefore, when you think about structural transformation, you have to think about two things. One, the modern sector has a higher level of productivity. That's why we want to switch away from agriculture. But in addition, the modern sector could also be a sector that almost automatically gets you faster productivity growth. So there's something about manufacturing, unlike agriculture, that once you start doing it, it's going to, and this is just a kind of empirical observation, that you get a convergence or automatic, think of it as automatic productivity growth in this sector. So if you wanted to think about structural transformation, therefore, what are the desirable features for a sector to exhibit? It must have a high level of productivity. It must become that automatic ladder to productivity growth. So the first one is a level effect. The second one is a change or a dynamic effect. And the third thing is that if you can then get an expansion of this dynamic sector, then you are going to achieve, or more likely to achieve, social transformation. And what is it that guarantees you may get expansion? One, if you can export a lot, that means the demand for that will be unlimited. You don't need to be constrained by your domestic market. So expansion you get with tradability. And the other thing for expansion that it's necessary is that these sectors should be aligned with what comparative advantage you have. So for example, just to give you an example, if a country has a lot of high skill but very few low skill labor, but if it turns out that the sectors that exhibit this unconditional convergence are the low skill sectors, then unlikely that there will be expansion. So what you need and what you have must be more in alignment. So that's what gives you structural transformation. Yeah. High level of productivity, dynamism, which is convergence, and the dynamic sector should expand. These are the three kind of features that will get you structural transformation, and it's through this lens rather than through the lens of manufacturing services that we need to examine underlying sectors. And one of the corollaries therefore is that, remember, when development thinking began, the whole thing was agriculture versus manufacturing. So it was modern versus traditional, traditional was agriculture, modern was manufacturing, but now modern could also be services. So then the question is not whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or manufacturing or services, but what sectors, what activities within these sectors will get you all these, which have all these desirable features, because the more you have them, the more you will get structural transformation. Now, so it is through this lens that I want to evaluate. We've done this. Okay. So the first thing I want to show you is this. So this is a paper that I've written with a colleague. So this shows you what is the value added per worker, 1984-2010, constant 2005 rupees, and what is the rate of growth in these sectors. So the key point I want you to take away from this is the following, that you see that manufacturing value added per worker is this, but straight away you should make the distinction. Not all manufacturing is manufacturing, not all manufacturing has all these properties. There's a big difference between registered manufacturing and unregistered manufacturing. Basically, unregistered manufacturing is not a modern sector at all. It is registered manufacturing that actually has some of these desirable properties. You see that productivity levels in registered manufacturing are like, six and a half times that in unregistered, and registered manufacturing is kind of 3 times or 4 times what it is in the aggregate economy. So straight away try and make a distinction between registered, and it's registered manufacturing that is, so that satisfies the first property, high productivity. Second property, is there convergence? We know by definition from Danny Roderick's work that once you get onto this, you get convergence. But for me, what is important also is that, do you get this convergence within a country and internationally? So for example, I think that if you look at some of agricultural yields and so on, you don't necessarily get this convergence phenomenon. Whereas in manufacturing, within India, if you somehow get onto manufacturing within India, it's likely that you will reach the frontier, at least the frontier within India, if not the frontier internationally. So manufacturing does seem, registered manufacturing does seem to have this property of dynamism. Now, here we come to the big problem. We know that registered manufacturing, high productivity, we know that it's dynamic, but for some reason, registered manufacturing has just not been expanding in India. Now, one data issue that we have to be careful about is that this is data based on the annual survey of industries. Now, we've had a revision of the national income accounts where these numbers have changed for manufacturing GVA, but the ASI data, this is still based on ASI data, and when the next ASI data comes out, I think this should be revisited, but I'm pretty confident that you will get broadly this phenomenon that even though manufacturing is a high productivity sector, even though it's dynamic, the sector just is not expanding in India, or expanding very slowly. Just to give you a contrast with Korea, this is the same thing, the share of employment, manufacturing employment in total employment, exactly the U shape that you saw, and you see that those numbers are per capita GDP, at different levels of employment shares. So Korea began poor. This is 1272, 3600, 6000, 16,000. No, so I don't want to say correlation is causation, but we saw the broader pattern that, and so the essential difference between, and this is the pattern, I'll show you China, I can show you the China chart as well. It's not dissimilar to this. So rising share of employment is what in manufacturing, in registered manufacturing, that's not happening today. Now we come to, I'm going to take an aside, an excursion into this phenomenon of premature deindustrialization. So essentially, when you look at the world today, whenever I'm asked this question or India's asked this question, look, can we get our manufacturing back? This question today and this question 30 years ago were very different questions, because today you have a lot of technological change, robotics, and so the employment possibilities today in manufacturing are very different from what they were 25, 30 years ago. And here we see that the signs are a bit disturbing globally. And by disturbing, what I mean is that there seems to be a phenomenon of premature deindustrialization happening. So how do we show that? And this is something that I did about 4 or 5 years ago. So this is a chart. On the x-axis you have GDP per capita, and on the y-axis is employment share in manufacturing. So this is for 3 different years. These are plots for, this is just the plot for, it's not there, but these are plots for 3 different years. This is 1988, this is 2010. This is the line of fit for all the countries in the sample. What you find is 2 really alarming things. One, what you see is that this curve is shifting downwards. That means that at every point in time now, there is less employment than there was before. For the world as a whole, this thing is declining, and so that means that at the same level of income in 2010, the average employment share is less than it used to be. The second thing that's happening is, sorry, I take that back. What I wanted to say is that this peak share of employment is coming down. That's the key point, that that we are now getting peak employment levels at much. So in 1988, the peak employment share amongst all the countries was 30%. Today, it's a bit less than 25%. So that's the first thing that's happening. So world over, we're getting less and less employment in manufacturing. The second thing that's happening is that notice that the peak point is also shifting to the left. You see all the curve are going down and shifting to the left. That means that the peak employment share is also happening earlier in the development process than later in the development process. That's what you mean by a leftward shift. What used to happen at, say, $15,000 per capita is now happening at $12,000 or $13,000 per capita. Also, what you see the world over is there's a big decline in low-skill employment. So this is the share of employment in broken up between intermediate skill, high skill, and low skill. What you find is that world over, it's the share in low skill employment that is coming down, and this is what could have impacts for all countries that are trying to become rich, including a country like India. Now, this is for me also, this is again research that I did 4 or 5 years ago. This is a table of all the states and says, what was the peak employment that this state ever reached? When did it reach it? And you can compare different states. Now, straight away, these are ranked by peak employment shares. Okay? Notice that the peak employment share, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Haryana, Punjab, Gujarat. And first, you get a sense of which are the manufacturing states. But the second thing is that these are peak employment shares. Remember, South Korea, the peak employment share was something like 25%. India, the peak employment shares are being reached, at much lower levels of employment. And in most states in India, almost most states except a few, they've peaked. Employment shares in manufacturing are slowly declining. Notice, look at this. Tamil Nadu reached its peak employment share 2010. Haryana, Punjab 2010. So that means that after that, they've started declining. There's no state here where I can see where the employment levels in share of employment in manufacturing is continuing to rise. Now, we don't know, of course, what's happened in the last 2, 3, 4 years. We need to look at the data. But you also see that the poorer states, look at the bottom, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, the poorer states are, like is happening internationally, are reaching their peak levels at much lower levels. The employment share is much lower, and they're reaching it at much lower levels of per capita GDP. Just to give you yeah, go ahead.
Small question. Is there a reason why you have such similar years across all the states, like 2010, 84 and 88 are the main years?
Well, there's 84, 88, 94, 2010, and so on. So 2010 could be because of the peak of the boom, and after that, it happened. But then there's still enough variation, 84. 88, 94. So there's enough variation in that. But some of it could be because after the boom, it starts happening everywhere. But there's still enough variation amongst this. So this is in fact actually a fairly disturbing sign about manufacturing, that within India. So just to give you one example, Uttar Pradesh, the per capita GDP, if you look at the, I'll tell you what the striking number is here. I want to show you, read out to you. So a country like Indonesia. So take India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, right? It's reached its peak share of manufacturing output at 10. I'm showing this in terms of employment. At a per capita state domestic product of about $1,200 in purchasing power. A country like Indonesia attained a manufacturing peak share of 29% at a per capita GDP of 5,800. So Uttar Pradesh's maximum level of industrialization was about 1/3 that in Brazil and Indonesia, and the decline began at 15 to 20% of the income levels of those countries. So not only are you seeing much lower employment shares, you're seeing them at much lower levels of income, and they've started. So this shows that premature deindustrialization, which is now a global phenomenon, is also happening within the states of India. Yeah.
For states like Gujarat, when we are seeing that they peaked in 84, but development in Gujarat is happening much later. So what explains these figures?
Yeah, so in the case of Gujarat, for example, it could be that it's just steady at this level for a long time. So you should go and look at the Gujarat chart. But the point is that there maybe the level is still quite high, so maybe that's what's keeping it going. But the surprising thing that is even in Gujarat, the employment share is. Now, it's possible that if you look at more recent data, some of these numbers will change. So someone should actually update this piece using the latest ASI data, for example. Yep.
We are only measuring the employment share in registered or formal manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
Now, because of the increasing number of subcontracting activity with the informal sector, so the informal employment, right? So what happens that from formal sector we are just subcontracting the activities more and more to the informal sectors in order to avoid.
So two responses. So that's a good question. There are two responses. The pattern that I showed you. This pattern in India, this pattern also holds for registered and unregistered combined. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is that even if it goes to suppose you say you get subcontracted, right? The point is that we know from the data, if it's unregistered, the levels of productivity are much lower. Yeah, so in that sense, that will not have the same dynamic properties as registered manufacturing, because remember, our perspective is we want high levels and rapid rates of growth of productivity, because that's what gives you lasting improvement in real wages and standards of living. Yeah.
But the reason why actually we are observing the declining or maybe stagnant employment share in registered manufacturing is because of the fact that more and more,
No, but if registered and unregistered are constant, it's not as if unregistered is rising. I've just told you that. Okay. Registered is constant, registered and unregistered is also constant in manufacturing. Yeah?
But as far as subcontracting is concerned, it automatically gets merged to the main contractor.
See, that depends upon accounting convention. I know, for example, this data, ASI data is based on establishment, factories. So the point that you're making is quite possible. If you are on the other hand measuring it in terms of company data, it would be a little bit different. But the point still is that even to the extent A, it's not happening very much, and B, even to the extent it's happening, it's not showing up as high productivity. And so we should worry about that, or rather we shouldn't take comfort in the fact that, oh, maybe registered is not doing well, unregistered is doing well, and therefore we're okay. Now, so there's a lot of literature on why hasn't manufacturing expanded. I don't want to go into all the details. There are hundreds and hundreds of papers on this. The most, I guess, at least in one sense, one of the most rigorous papers is a paper by Chang Tai Hsieh and Pete Klenow, and what they basically show is that for a number of reasons, total factor productivity growth in Indian manufacturing could be at least double if some of the distortions in India's labor markets, capital markets, and land markets could be eliminated. But they show that basically both India and China there are a lot of distortions which lead to generally lower levels of productivity, and so that could be. Another reason why we could see that, you see, remember that I said that the two attributes that could lead to employment share rising are, one, that it's exportable, and by definition all registered manufacturing is exportable, so registered manufacturing meets that property. But it's possible that we are doing registered manufacturing in skill intensive activities, and maybe India doesn't have enough skill intensity in its population. So it is actually true that if you look at the share of value added and in skill industries and employment, that has been rising over time. I highlighted this earlier when we speak about India's precocious pattern of specialization. We do more services than manufacturing that most countries at this level of development, and even within manufacturing we do much more skill intensive manufacturing. And this, the reason why this could impede, remember the basic problem is that these high productive dynamic sectors are not expanding. So the argument could be that these require a lot of skill, and maybe we don't have that much skill in our population, and that's why it kind of becomes an impediment to the further expansion of these sectors. Now, so remember what I said was that therefore don't think manufacturing, don't think services, think about underlying properties. So that is especially true of services, because services is just a label. Services is just a label for all kinds of different activities, Some of them could be capital intensive like telecommunications, some of them could be highly labor intensive like construction. Some of them could be tradable, like IT services, and some of them could be completely non-tradable like construction. Some of them could be high productive, some of them could be low productive. Some of them could be dynamic, some of them need not be dynamic. So when you think about these broad categories, you should again think about, so take for example levels, the same analysis we did for productivity, the level of productivity. Take services for example. You have real estate and business services, basically where the value added per worker is very, very high, And on the other hand, we have something like construction, where the value added is very low. Similarly, this is relatively low, trade, hotels, whereas financial services is very high. So if you look at registered and unregistered manufacturing, you can compare them with the different service sectors. So again, manufacturing and services are almost kind of not very meaningful categories in order to analyze the transformation process. Now, do these things have the same property as manufacturing? It turns out that maybe service sectors do not exhibit this convergence, and therefore they may not have the dynamic properties. Now, what you find in India in the service sector pretty much is basically what's happening to the registered in manufacturing is happening in services as well, i.e. that the very productive service sectors are not expanding and the less productive service sectors are expanding.
This real estate is declining. Can you elaborate on that? Last on 1984 and 2010.
Oh yeah. So let me go to them.
Yeah.
So I mean, one possible. Remember, again, real estate is now broken down into. You could have real estate and other business services. You will have to do a greater decomposition to see why that's happening. Offhand, I can't give you a very good reason why that's happening. It could be that 2010 we had, by that time after the global financial crisis, maybe we had a real estate crash in prices and so on. So that could be one reason why this has declined. But that's a good question. I don't know the detailed answer to that. But in most other sectors you see a similar thing. For example, financial services and insurance between 2000 and 2010, similar thing happening. 2010, remember, all the financial services were also badly affected by the global financial crisis. So bottom line is that if you do a manufacturing versus services scorecard and you look at our 5 attributes: high productivity, convergence, skill profile matches, and tradable, what you find in India, the paradox basically is that the high skill sectors, high value added sectors are not expanding. It's the relatively lower skill, lower value added sectors, the less dynamic sectors that are expanding. And in a sense, this is kind of the dilemma of structural transformation in India. That so that's why I think the Make in India program is so important, because essentially it's trying to both increase the share of high productive, more dynamic sectors like registered manufacturing, but certainly until 2010, which is when we stopped the analysis, this is kind of the fundamental dilemma of structural transformation in India, that the really dynamic, high productive sectors are not seeing an increase, are not attracting resources, and are not expanding as much as they should. So in a sense, this kind of encapsulates the Indian structural transformation story.
In the previous slide, the wages were deflated by CPI or that growth one. CPI or sector-specific GDP deflator?
No, this is sector-specific GDP deflator, value added per worker in those sectors at constant prices.
Sector-specific.
Yes, well, yeah. Questions? Because I don't want to now spend too much time on this. One of the things that, question, yeah?
So one thing is, when you are explaining about skill industry, you are taking NSSO data, I think.
Yeah.
And the second question that I have is, as we all know that India and any other country is moving towards, are integrating towards global value chains.
India less so, by the way.
Yeah, India less so. But given the fact that our manufacturing sector is towards low skill intensive, how do you see that it will benefit out of global value chains if we are just stuck at lower value addition industries? compared to high?
So the answer is exactly, you've asked, you've almost answered your own question, because I think it's becoming part of value-added chains that increases the skill upgradation and value addition. You become part of value-added chains precisely in order to increase that, and that's the part of the the convergence, the dynamism that Danny Roderick was speaking about. It happens partly by becoming integrated with value-added chains. Because if you're isolated from, so in fact many people would argue that we have not done this precisely because we've not become a part of value-added chains. Yeah.
There's one more point I wanted to add to this.
Question, yeah.
No,
Yeah, Mike, yeah.
Yes, sir. There's just one more point I wanted to add to this, that when you participate in global value chains, the volume effect also plays a big role there. So even if you're involved in a low skill,
You'll do more of it.
you'll do more,
Exactly.
like China, like
Exactly.
Apple iPad, they only do $4 when the value is 130, 150. But because the volume effect is so much, it benefits.
But
them.
over time, what tends to happen is that
They do move
yeah,
up.
exactly, yeah. Mike here, Mike here, yeah. Only questions, please.
The question that I wanted to ask is that if we take Bangladesh's performance in value-added chains, largely the performance comes from low skill, low value addition. It is that they are using a comparative advantage of cheap labor, and that also low skill labor. So to say that being embedded in global value chains would necessarily improve upon skill gradations or high valuations, is it true?
Okay, so just to give you a case study, one last question there, one last question,
Sir, about not clothes and shoes, but some commodity now which developed country do not produce, and that responsibility means they give us and we produce that commodities, which is very harmful for environment, and for which we get some amount from them.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example before?
For example, leather production, e-waste.
Why is leather? I mean, why? After all, if you
tanning of a leather in a Sion Dharavi.
No.
I mean, some chemical processing is required on some commodity which is very harmful for the environment, and the rich country do not like to produce or processing on them, and that they give poor East Asian countries. And so that, for example, Japan is on a mining, they give that work to the Thailand, and for that they provide the infrastructure. I have read this in some book. So
Okay.
I'm asking that which commodity we are producing, which developed country don't like to produce.
So I generally don't think in terms of what people are making us produce or not making us produce.
Please, sir, I am talking about that.
See, let
shoes and clothes.
let me give you a concrete example of shoes and clothes, right?
Okay.
So what you find is that in the development process, if you look at all these East Asian countries, including China, the pathway to higher exports and to rapid export growth and overall growth was textiles and clothing and leather and footwear, because these were relatively labor intensive sectors, and it allowed these countries to actually export a lot, produce a lot, and grow a lot. And in some ways, one of the reasons why our share of manufacturing has been constant over time is because perhaps we did not do at the right time, we did not do enough clothing and textiles, we did not do enough leather and footwear. So for example, these are charts of the years after takeoff. So this is T1, means for every year we see when did their growth take off. And what you find is that remarkably, takeoffs of growth are associated with takeoffs of clothing and leather and footwear. This is kind of a stylized fact. Look at Korea, for example. It did a lot of leather and footwear. China is doing a lot of leather and footwear. Now the thing is that, if there are some environmental costs to it, I think we need to, countries take measures, regulatory measures to do that. Maybe some countries don't do that. I don't know, and maybe they should. But the point is that the stylized fact is that all these growth transitions in the East Asian countries have, and including Bangladesh, look at Bangladesh for example, that orange line, ever since they started growing, one of the big things that happened, or one of the vehicles for Bangladesh's structural transformation has in fact been the clothing sector. And of course, in the case of Bangladesh, the clothing sector has also led to a rapid increase in female labor force participation, which is now much greater than India's. And the clothing sector has been a real instrument of that. So that is why, looking at this last year, the government put together a package to try and incentivize, the clothing sector. And in the last budget, also something was announced for the leather and footwear sectors. I mean, it's an open question whether we can do, clothing and things. Because, see, the logic of clothing, more clothing and less footwear, but both is the following. They have 3 or 4 very desirable properties from a development transformation perspective. One, they offer rapid opportunity for exports. And this is what these countries have shown. 2, that in clothing especially, it's highly unskilled labor intensive and highly female labor intensive as well. So in all these countries, therefore, this desirable property of, your comparative advantage is in low skill. So you produce a lot of that. It's also a thing where you can export, therefore you're not constrained by any demand constraints, and also a lot of women take part. So this association is very strong, and that's why I think the government wants to and has been trying to boost the clothing and to some extent the leather and footwear sector. Now, in the leather and footwear sector, it's absolutely true what you raised, that the difference is that there are some environmental issues in leather and footwear, and unless I think we solve those problems through, for example, higher regulation, for example, better regulation, then it's possible that growth could be associated with more environmental costs. But the point is that historically, the countries that have grown rapidly have actually done a lot of footwear and leather and a lot of textiles and clothing. Question?
In this graph, if we just take out the footwear and just concentrate on the leather,
yeah,
will India still be at the bottom of the growth path?
If you focus on leather?
Only on leather.
Yeah.
Just take out the footwear.
So we have the data, we can do that. The problem is, remember that leather is very low value addition. So in that sense, one should decompose that, but we can check what the graph looks like. But it's kind of footwear that is the kind of, just as in textiles and clothing. See, on clothing I've just included here just clothing, because textiles doesn't have the same kind of properties, and that would probably also be true of leather as well. And so we could look into why this has happened. You see, for example, the jobs per lack of investment. In all the industries, it's highest in apparels and leather and footwear. And look at the female jobs per unit of investment. It's very, very high. In fact, I think for every 1 new job that's created in clothing, probably 60 to 70% of those go to women employment. So it's also very good for social transformation, improving women's agency and bargaining power. In fact, I remember about 1.5 years ago, I went to one of these clothing factories, which is a big exporting factory, clothing factory, and spoke to some of the women there. And I mean, the women's, one woman I remember very saying, सुबह मेरा मियाँ मेरे को चाय पिलाता है क्योंकि मैं घर जाता हूँ, मैं काम करने जाता हूँ और मेरा मियाँ मुझे चाय पिलाता है और शाम को सब्जी वब्जी काट के रखता है मेरे लिए. So this is social transformation in action. So for all of those male chauvinists here, don't send your women to clothing. Don't send your women to work in clothing factories. So the potential and Bangladesh, this has been one. I mean, it's a very strong correlation between the growth of the clothing sector and this. See, the difference also between Bangladesh and India is that Bangladesh has attracted a lot of FDI in textiles and clothing. It has become part of value-added chains, and even Indian exports is very much not linked to global value-added chains. Now,
But just 1 minute. Even there is the Rana Plaza kind of a situation also in Bangladesh, and it is also said there are several studies which shows differential wages for male and gendered labor. So female labor or the feminization of labor may not necessarily be an empowering issue.
okay, now let me I have to push back on both your observations, right? One, I mean, the fact that you have Rana Plaza type episodes, I mean, these are one-off things. It doesn't mean that 25 years of kind of transformation is negated by that. Point number one. Point number two is that it is possible both that female wages are lower than male wages and possible that female wages have been rising much more than in India. So they're both possible. Or in other words, the wedge between female and male wages in India could be much greater than in Bangladesh. So I think there's some national pride coming in. I think we should sing Jana Gana Mana here, maybe in reverse order. But I think Bangladesh has done a terrific job on this in a way that we haven't on the clothing sector. And we have to learn from the good experiences. There's no such thing as, I don't think, I know that we all want to think that India does the best in all possible sectors all the time, but sometimes it may not be true. So let's learn as well. Then, sorry? Oh, I see. That's why I noticed. Oh, that's why these things are all coming up. But there, no question. We have to. Yeah, exactly. It's really there's no question. Maybe I think after the match is over, we should go and visit their textiles factories and. Okay. So see, the other reason why I think that clothing is seen as a kind of potential sector for India is that clothing worldwide is just dominated by China. China has, if you look at world exports, China probably exports 30 to 40% of world exports in clothing. Similarly, a huge amount in footwear as well. But because Chinese wages have been rising very rapidly, you see this. So what has been happening is that look at China's wages in dollar terms and look at that in India and Bangladesh. This is what potentially creates an opening for India, because as Chinese wages rise, they become uncompetitive. So a lot of the FDI that was in China has been moving out of China to other places. For example, they've moved to Vietnam, they've moved to Cambodia, they've moved to Ethiopia and all these other places. And we haven't been able to attract as much investment in these sectors despite having lower wages. So the question is, why is that the case? Look at Chinese share in global exports. I was telling you the number. Oh, so look at this. In terms of apparels, China's share is 40%. I was not far off. Footwear, 40%. Can you imagine one country dominating world, things like this? So, all these sectors face a lot of common challenges. Logistics are a problem, labor regulations, tax and tariff policy. And then the one key thing I want to show you is that one reason why, and we're going to, just to prefigure the trade module that's going to come, one of the key reasons is that these are tariffs faced in other markets for Indian exports. So you see, for example, Bangladesh faces 0 tariffs in the European Union, while we face tariffs of almost 10%. Similarly, in Canada, Bangladesh faces 0. And look at Ethiopia, which is also now attracting a lot of FDI. It faces 0 tariffs in these other markets, whereas look, we face pretty high tariffs in many of these markets. So one strategy, therefore, to try and boost clothing exports would be for India to try and ask partner countries to reduce the tariffs to our clothing exports. And I will talk about that to some extent when you look at the free trade agreement thing. So bottom line is that structural transformation depends on particular sectors, particular attributes of sectors. I think in the Indian case, I do think clothing and footwear are things that we lost kind of the opportunities to do this 25, 30 years ago because we did more services than manufacturing. And the question is whether we can, the train that left the station 25, 30 years ago, can we run after it and pull it back and gain some of that is the question that we have now for. So I'm going to stop here because I want to move on to quickly do another module before we move on to the second half of the thing. Any questions?
When are you calculating GDP per worker? You are using the ASI data. Does that employment covers contract level workers also?
No, I think in the ASI, if you have contract labor, it's not part of your payroll. It wouldn't be part of value added per worker.
But when you are calculating or you are doing that, they include direct workers, like they include women, men, and
direct workers.
And they also include directly employed contract workers. So my question is that when you are calculating that, like GDP per worker, so you are actually including those or not?
So it depends on what the ASI data includes. If the ASI data, I don't think it includes, we'll check that for you, it may not include contract workers.
Using the data, so it includes contract worker and wages are there for contract workers too.
Okay.
And second question is then when are you talking about the expansion? Are you talking about the number of exports increase?
Expansion, no. See, in all that I showed, to me, expansion of a sector means increasing the employment in that sector. Because that's what, you want more people to get employed, and that's how you increase, national productivity and income. So employment share has to increase. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. One question here.
Sir, you have talked about the lower wages in India.
You have talked about the lower wages in India, especially in the textile sector, which is going to be an advantage. So there is also a large number of people who are moving out of the textile sector, especially handlooms, because of the fact that they are not earning regular wages, like adequate amount of wages. So how do you view this?
See, I think that, remember that wages being lower is one necessary condition for it to be a possible profitable opportunity. It has to be coupled with reasonable levels of productivity, because unless they are reasonably productive and work whatever 8, 10, 12 hours, you won't get that. So the handloom thing could be different also. The handloom thing could also be that people buy less and less handloom over time. Demand could be coming down. So that's the difference, exactly the difference between tradable and non-tradable sectors. That in the case of handloom, basically you require the domestic market to sustain that, whereas in these other cases, you need the international market to sustain it, because international market means demand is infinite. For a small open economy, demand is infinite. Whereas for handloom, it's constrained by how much demand there is within India. And so what you're saying could be happening because people are buying less and less handloom. In fact, I corrected someone who said, you said, we favor we kind of penalize cotton and do this. So here's the paradox that I didn't, it's in the charts. The most dynamic export sector in the world is not cotton, it's man-made fiber. And therefore, if we discriminate against a man-made fiber by favoring cotton exports, we will actually lose some international export opportunities. So there's a dilemma there. Okay, one question here. Yeah, please.
Sir, why there is a discrimination for Indian exports to European Union? Bangladesh and Ethiopia is not
so that's a good question. I think that so there are two reasons, two ways this happen. One is that advanced countries like the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, they give zero tariff access to very low income countries. And Bangladesh is below the cutoff and India is not. So that's one reason. The second reason is that countries negotiate these things with each other. So there are countries, for example, which are richer than Bangladesh, which may still have zero tariffs because they've had these negotiations with Europe, and Europe has said, we'll bring down your tariffs here, you bring down your tariffs elsewhere, so it's kind of a mutual bargain, a negotiating situation. We are neither poor enough to qualify for that, nor have we engaged in these negotiations to bring down those tariffs. But I think this is something that the government, I think, wants to do. Huh?
Negotiation is on.
The negotiation is on, exactly. The negotiation is on, exactly. Yeah, question, yeah? Please, sir.
Tariff question. The chart that you just showed earlier, even China has quite a high tariff rate. So how does that?
I mean, China is just hugely productive, and so let's not go. So, in fact, that's a good question. Chinese tariffs are as much as Indian tariffs, but because they have done everything. They've had FDI, they have labor mobility, they have cheap labor, they provided good infrastructure, their ports along the coast, their logistics are so good. All these things combined, all the things that I said, India, the challenges that India has. Let's see, I'll show you. I went through that very quickly. Logistics, labor regulations, all these things are much, much better in China, and that's why they have. And a reflection of that is that China, 40% of world exports is China in clothing and footwear. 40%, one country. It's just unimaginable, actually, that any one country could do that. Yeah. Okay, so can we quickly move to, I want to take you through urbanization, and Parth here will help me if I make mistakes. So I just want to show you, remember that everyone talks about urbanization as being a very important development phenomenon. As countries grow, they urbanize, and how you manage urbanization is going to be a very important component, a very important determinant of long-term development. So according to the official data, we have about 1/3 of India is urbanized, but Parth tells me that if you do this correctly using satellites and so on, it turns out that maybe the urbanization rate is something more like 42%, not 1/3. And I think what is urbanization is almost a philosophical question, right? What is a city? Where do you draw the line? It's almost a philosophical question. My friend there, I thought you were going to say, let's nationalize the cities as well. Yeah? So let's. See, many people have said that India is not urbanized enough, but the chart on the left shows that for the latest data that we have, India is, given its level of development, it's pretty much, it's maybe a little less urbanized, but not a whole lot less urbanized than other countries given the level of development. So this is at a point in time. The right-hand side chart shows you how urbanization has proceeded over the course of development for India, China, and the US, and pretty much it seems like we are on the trajectory that other countries have broadly followed. So the notion that India is under-urbanized, I think we need to treat that with a bit of caution, because I think certainly this kind of data is tricky. There is one very, very unusual kind of here is where I hope, please don't fall asleep. I'm going to say something a little bit technical. There's something called Zipf's law. Zipf's law basically says that the second biggest city will have half the population of the biggest city. The third biggest city will have 1/3 the population of the top city, and so on and so forth. And this is just an empirical regularity that they find about cities. And the top two charts, basically you have the log of population on the x-axis and the log of the rank. So the top one is a rank, and though you do the log of 1 and but take away 1/2 or half or whatever, but essentially countries, those are points, cities, they fall along that line. So that second biggest is half, third biggest is 1/3. The funny thing about India, what you find is that both the biggest cities and the smallest cities do not conform to Zipf's law. So there's something about Indian urbanization, about the pattern of urbanization, where the biggest cities are not big enough and the smaller cities are also not big enough. And this is the puzzle about Indian urbanization. So the law says that if n is the rank of the city, the population of that city will be 1/n, relative to the where one, if you're one, you have the biggest city, you have population, whatever. The second city will have half the population of the biggest city. Third will have 1/3 the population of the biggest city. It's like a log relationship. And what you find is that India doesn't conform. And so it's interesting, why is it that, so it's not that aggregate urbanization maybe is not enough, but the pattern of urbanization might be very different in India. And so I'm told, for example, now if you talk to people who work on, who have these employment agencies, they say now that migration doesn't happen to Bombay because rental costs are too high. So you would rather go to a third-tier city for half the wages than you would go to Mumbai or Delhi for 2 or 3 times the wages, because rentals are so high, because land has not been properly allocated in some ways. Now, Indian cities, this is a ranking of Indian selectees as per some infrastructure index. I mean, Indian cities don't do very well in a global ranking. New Delhi and Mumbai are placed 47th and 50th. This is in terms of infrastructure quality. Now, the interesting thing is that now more and more we are getting data to be able to rank ULBs, urban local bodies. We're able to rank them in terms of the quality of these cities. Can you ask a couple to come quickly? So you see that, for example, in terms of service provision, Chennai and Pune stand out. Ranchi and Raipur and Bhubaneswar are kind of bottom of the rankings. You can also rank them on transparency and so on. See, one of the interesting things is that it turns out that the quality of services that's rendered in cities is related a lot to, associated a lot with how much resources they have. So if you have more staff, if you have more own revenue, you tend to provide better services. So one question then becomes, which cities generate enough revenue and which cities don't. It turns out that it's not necessarily the case. So on the x-axis here, you have taxation powers. You can actually rank cities in terms of how much taxation power they have and in terms of how much revenue they generate. It turns out that there are cities like Mumbai and Pune which are not high on taxation but tend to get a fair amount of resources. And there are lots of cities here which do have taxation powers but don't generate too much revenue. So you cannot say, looking at this, that what is impeding the raising of resources by cities is some formal lack of taxation powers. It's actually maybe just that they don't do it, they don't want to do it, they're unable to do it. These are maybe more likely reasons why they don't generate enough resources. So in this last year's survey, Parth made use of satellite data to see what is the potential property tax potential of 2 cities, Bangalore and Jaipur. And the results we got were quite striking. And essentially what we found is that Parth is the expert on this. All kinds of sophisticated technology goes into doing these charts. But essentially what we show is that Jaipur, for example, could generate 10 times, maybe even 15 times more property tax revenue than it actually does, just by looking at what kind of built-in area they have. Similarly, Bangalore can collect easily 5-6 times more than it could. So this is an example of how you can use technology to kind of augment, at least estimate what tax potential you have. And so the 14th Finance Commission, of course, had a lot to say on local governments. They were required to spend the grants on the basic functions. And remember that just as the Finance Commission allocates money across the states, so local bodies, they too had to, the states have to allocate to local bodies also giving this thing. And the 14th Finance Commission said that every state there should be for every municipality and Gram Panchayat, there should be a performance grant, i.e. not to give money completely untied, but to have some measure of performance as well. Of course, one of the Prime Minister's big initiatives is the 100 smart cities. And so this is something that's happening. If you want to read more about it, you should go to the website, follow what's happening. There are some, for example, Gift City in Gujarat is one example of a smart city. Of course, the new capital of Andhra Pradesh, Amravati, will also be one of the smart cities. So let's see how this smart city is evolving. I don't know a whole lot about the details of this, but if you wanted to teach a course on this in your classroom, the one person you should not invite is me. Thank you. So let's move on to the. I don't think we have too much time. I think we're going to move on to the next. Can we have the next? 5 minutes. Okay. 2:52, 3 o'clock. You have to be back. Yeah.